Imagine having to watch your family member's funeral by way of a smartphone or tablet. Imagine being told that only 10 people are allowed to attend a loved one's homegoing. Imagine your spouse dying from symptoms related to coronavirus, but you have no earthly idea when you can have the proper burial for that family member. Folks, this is the harsh reality for many Americans who are trying to figure out how to plan a funeral and pay their last respects to a loved one in a time where government mandates are telling us to social distance and not to gather by more than 10. Joining us to talk about how to plan a funeral in the middle of the coronavirus crisis is Hari P. Close, international president of the National Funeral Directors and Morticians Association, which spans 22 countries and thousands of members. Mr. Close, thanks for joining me on the Damien Jones podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity to share, and hopefully we'll be able to help some families even at times like these.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, Hari, 23,000 deaths that we know of worldwide, and a little bit over 1,000 right here in the United States, and we know that number will continue to increase. Talk to me and tell me how this pandemic is affecting the funeral home industry.
Well, I think it affects all of us. It's now a new norm. Unfortunately, as funeral directors, we're always in an awkward situation when someone passes. But now we also have to be following the laws, these state emergencies in cities and states and the federal government, trying to keep an eye on the CDC in the United States and the World Health Organization on this particular this pandemic, of health. And most funeral directors, we deal with health issues like this every day, maybe not as extreme, but our staff is accessible to so many diseases that most people are not aware of. But when now we have to 10 people or less, that is a very difficult
I'm sure
way to have to talk to families, to emphasize to families what 10 means. What we have tried to do, and our members have tried to do, is make sure the funeral director is not included. Some will leave
in that count.
In that 10. Because most people forget the minister's one, the organist is one, if there's a funeral director is one. And when I say try not to stay in that room, actually the funeral director is in another room, or maybe monitoring that particular service. And other staff members might be outside making sure that only 10 go into that chapel. And there's some ways you can get around it, but when you're having the actual funeral and 10 family members are sitting there, 10 means 10. And that's why new technology is now becoming a norm.
Yeah, so I know that can be extremely taxing. You're talking about families. Look, 3 million people just applied for unemployment last week, which is unheard of. And so now you have people down on their luck financially. Folks are trying to figure out how to keep food on the table as well. And then you lose a loved one. And that can be a place of consolation, of support for one another. But now we're told that we can't gather. I mean, you kind of expound on that. You know, what is that looking like? And how social distancing can apply to the actual process.
Well, you hit it right on. Not only 10 people can go to the funeral, but you have to be 6 feet apart. And so what we had to do is take our chapel and actually take 10 seatings and space them and tell the families when they come, after they view their loved one, they have to sit in these seats, and it has to be scattered through so they're not sitting next to each other. And especially in our community and some other cultures where human touch and hugs are part of their rituals, it is a very difficult situation to tell someone not to touch. I spent almost 5 hours today trying to find the thermal thermometers, so that way we can have them at the door and outside our door. And you can imagine they're all gone, just like toilet paper.
Yeah. So as you are, you and your team and your membership are making the adjustments to accommodate families in such a tough time. I read in a few pieces in the New York Times and other outlets where, as I mentioned earlier in the beginning of the interview, that people have to are sitting in the parking lot of the church or whatever the place is, because they can't make that 10 number, and they have to watch the funeral proceedings on their smartphone, on their tablet. Some people are doing it on the same outlet, Zoom, that we are going to do this particular conversation. I mean, that is unheard. To talk about the increase that you're seeing when it comes to that type of technology in the recent weeks.
Well, let me first say, and I have to give a disclaimer to my staff. I have a very young staff that innovated. I have been fighting them for years on the technology, live streaming, Zoom, Facebook Live. I didn't see an actual need for those features, even though some of my colleagues might have them. But in the last couple of weeks, we have everything set up, live streaming. I see a value even using my iPad. So generational difference. But if you're going to do business to help this family, you have no other choice but have live streaming. It's unfortunate for the families.
How are families responding to having to use that to live stream such a private situation?
Well, in that situation, we have to also tell them that once you live stream, other people have access. It will stay on the system for 6 months. I think it's been a positive and a negative, where people don't want to see their loved one on some type of video, but at the same time, at least people can see. I've had some people that were live streaming and then talking to family members while they're at the funeral, saying, "Could you just touch mama for me?
Oh, wow.
Touch their hand for me.
Oh, wow.
And could you kiss them on the forehead?" You know, all those, at least they're feeling that someone's representing their needs. So we have a situation where last Saturday, we had 3 services. They were scheduled at church. They were scheduled when it used to be 50 and under. Then it moved from the CDC and the governor of Maryland and the president of the United States moving it to 10. And then you got to work with the families then, because some of my colleagues, gave out certain passes, certain armbands, so that way we knew who could come in. And we had to tell the family it's been changed. It's only 10.
Wow.
And so some of them did not have day prior viewing. We went and gave them a 4-hour day prior viewing, and 10 people in, 10 people out. They can't sit around. They can sign the book. They can view, and that's the way we got around it, so at least other people could see. But the day of the funeral, not only is it 10 people, you have 1 hour for the funeral after it gets started, because you still are exposing yourself to unknown.
Unknowns, yeah.
And here's the thing that's funeral directors and in particular bombers have always been aware of. The death certificate doesn't always tell you what the cause of death is. And so here we're in the unknown. About 2 weeks ago, I spoke at an international conference representing our association in Auckland, what they call Auckland, New Zealand, and I had to go through Fiji to get there. The issue was coming in the United States. People were trying to cancel what the airline says is not in our area. So I get to Fiji, and I'm temperature checked and nose swiped. Got my email and my cell number. Get to New Zealand, the same thing. On return, we did the repeat. When I get to the United States, there was not even one person passing out pamphlets. So
they even inform you as to what's going on, or
there was no one worried about. People were wearing masks, but there was nothing, letting know there's a health issue. This is what you need to do, and it really was alarming. As it's the powerful country in the world, that we kind of were behind on the 8 ball.
Well, that's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother day. All right. So, what planning advice? Damien Jones podcast, speaking with international president of the National Association of Funeral Directors and Morticians, Harry P. Close. All right. What planning advice would you give these families who have lost a loved one? And as we know that death toll will continue to increase, those who will lose a loved one, what kind of planning advice would you give folks to kind of just, be prepared and be in the best mindset and just try to make this situation, a tough situation,
Yeah.
as easy as possible?
Well, first of all, my prayer is going to be with all of them when that moment happens. It's never a comfortable and easy time. Some of my colleagues, depending on which state and city you are, will only allow 2 people to come to make arrangements if you're coming to the funeral.
Mm-hmm.
If we have the vehicle that you and I are using, that's another option. But most funeral homes will only allow 2 people the people who are making the decision. The families must understand it's not the funeral director does not want to celebrate your loved one's life. We are mandated by the state emergency acts to follow the federal and state governments. There are some ways you can be creative and have viewings, but it still only be 10 people to be allowed at a time. When it comes to the actual funeral, unfortunately, it's going to be 10 people. And I keep emphasizing because some of my colleagues have been fined. In some states, 5,000. In the state of Maryland, 5,000 plus 1 year in jail. I have some of my colleagues that are telling families that they must sign a waiver and over 50 people. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues don't realize they're still held accountable because they're making someone sign a waiver under duress. And the law says 10. 10 means 10 fingers, no exception to the rule. That's another subject matter to my colleagues that do this for a living.
Right.
To the families, depending on where you live. Some of the state governments are only limited direct cremations or direct burials. Depending on the cemetery you select, some cemeteries will only allow the hearse and one family car. Some cemeteries will allow the family cars, more family cars, but they can't get out their cars.
Wow. So many restrictions.
So I'm sorry, go ahead, what you say?
I said there's so many different restrictions to this.
Different restrictions depending on the city and the state. Garrison Forest here in Baltimore, the state of Maryland, all state cemeteries from now on will lock the gate after every funeral. And that funeral home will have to open the gate once it's their turn, drive the hearse in one family car, and they will go directly to the chapel. I had a colleague today that said that they had to have their families, the other families that followed the procession, parked outside the cemetery, and they can watch from the distance. And someone had a smartphone recording it live off their Facebook where they can watch. So these are things that families have to, as difficult as it is for them, we also got to make sure that we're not saying that they have it. We don't know, because
we have to be precautious.
We got very much. So the cemeteries are being like that. They didn't allow at cemeteries. Funeral directors usually bring the paperwork into the office. They're meeting us at the chapels. They're meeting us at the graveside, so that even funeral directors and the staff of the cemetery have limited exposure.
So many restrictions, so many adjustments that we have to make in such a tough time. But we pray that everybody is practicing, safe habits.
Yes.
We continue to pray that folks will stay safe.
Yes.
And we thank you for joining us on the podcast to kind of give those folks who have lost someone or will lose someone some practical advice and how to move through it. R.I.P. Close, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you. And I'm praying for the world.